April 4th, 1945, Oberursel, Germany. The morning mist clung to the cobblestone streets as women gathered in hushed circles outside the bakery, clutching their ration cards with trembling hands. From their windows, they had spotted American tanks at the edge of town, and among the arriving soldiers, dark faces that sent waves of terror through the community. Frau Ingrid Weber pressed her daughter Helga closer to her side, whispering assurances she herself didn't believe. "Remember what the radio said," she murmured to the other women. "Hide in the cellars. The Negroes know nothing of civilization." Little did these women realize that within days, their most fundamental beliefs about their supposed enemies would crumble, replaced by a reality that would shake the very foundation of everything they had been taught to believe. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the story of how propaganda's carefully constructed myths collapsed in the face of simple human decency, and how chocolate bars from American GI pockets did more to defeat Nazi ideology in one small German town than 1,000 counter-propaganda broadcasts. By the spring of 1945, the Third Reich was crumbling. The Eastern Front had collapsed under the Soviet onslaught, while in the West, American, British and French forces pushed steadily into Germany. For Germans who had lived under 12 years of Nazi rule, the approaching Allied armies represented not just military defeat, but an existential threat. Nazi propaganda had spent years portraying the Allied soldiers, especially non-white troops, as barely human savages bent on rape, murder and destruction. In the town of Oberursel, just north of Frankfurt, Ingrid Weber, a 34-year-old widow, lived with her two children, Helga, aged 9, and Kurt, aged 12. Her husband Wilhelm, an infantry lieutenant with the 77th Infantry Division, had been killed near Smolensk in 1943. Like many German civilians, Ingrid's understanding of the world had been shaped entirely by Nazi propaganda for over a decade. The Völkischer Beobachter newspaper, official broadcasts, and Goebbels' carefully crafted messaging had been her only sources of information. "The American army is a mongrel army," the radio had announced just 3 days earlier. "The Negroid troops especially have been promised German women as rewards. They are animals, not soldiers. Hide your daughters, prepare to defend your honor." These warnings were not new. They had intensified as American forces breached the Rhine. But now, with the sounds of artillery audible in the distance, they took on new urgency. Ingrid had spent the morning gathering what food she could find. The ration system was barely functioning, and hunger had become a constant companion for most Germans. She hurried home along Feldbergstrasse, the main road through town, keeping her eyes lowered as she passed a group of Hitler Youth boys digging tank traps near the town hall. They couldn't have been older than 15, their faces gaunt, and their uniforms too large for their thin frames. "Why aren't you helping?" one called to her. "The Führer expects everyone to defend the fatherland." Ingrid quickened her pace, clutching her basket containing 2 turnips and a small loaf of dense grey bread, her family's food for the next 2 days. At home, Helga was tending to their small garden, while Kurt was nowhere to be seen. "Where is your brother?" Ingrid asked, a note of panic in her voice. "With the Volkssturm men at the eastern roadblock," Helga replied, her small hands dirty from pulling weeds. "Herr Müller came by and said all boys over 10 were needed." Ingrid felt her heart sink. The Volkssturm, the hastily organized militia of old men and boys, had been mobilized in their area just a week earlier. The idea of her 12-year-old son facing American tanks with a Panzerfaust rocket launcher was unbearable. She set down her basket and headed back out, walking quickly toward the eastern edge of town. Meanwhile, on the other side of the nearby hills, Staff Sergeant James Washington of the 701st Tank Battalion, the famed Black Panthers, sat on the turret of his Sherman tank, studying a map with his commander, Lieutenant Thomas Morrison. The 761st was one of the segregated African-American units in the still segregated U.S. Army, having proven their combat effectiveness since their commitment to battle in November 1944. "Intelligence says there's minimal resistance in Oberursel," Morrison explained, pointing to the map. "A few Volkssturm units, maybe some Hitler Youth. No regular Wehrmacht troops reported." Washington nodded, his expression serious. At 25, he had already seen more combat than most soldiers, having fought his way across France and into Germany. A former college student from Philadelphia, Washington had enlisted after Pearl Harbor, determined to serve despite the discrimination he faced in the military and at home. "How are we handling the civilian population, sir?" Washington asked. "Standard procedure. No fraternization, but we provide basic humanitarian aid. These people have been fed lies about us for years," Morrison replied, "especially about you and your men." Washington knew this all too well. The 761st had encountered German propaganda leaflets specifically targeting black soldiers, attempting to sow racial division within American ranks. One captured document had claimed that black soldiers were being used as cannon fodder by white officers who considered them expendable. "My men know the drill, sir," Washington assured him, "professional at all times." In a nearby half-track, Private First Class Marcus Johnson checked his equipment. At 19, Johnson was one of the youngest members of the unit, a Mississippi native who had never left his home state before joining the Army. Unlike Washington, who had experienced relative freedom in the North, Johnson had grown up under the oppressive Jim Crow laws of the Deep South. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was fighting for freedom in Europe while lacking basic rights at home. Sitting next to Johnson was Corporal Robert Jackson, a 28-year-old former schoolteacher from Detroit. Jackson was the intellectual of the squad, often found reading whatever books he could get his hands on during lulls in the fighting. He had joined the Army, seeking both to serve his country and to prove through action what many white Americans refused to acknowledge, that black Americans were just as capable, just as patriotic, and just as deserving of full citizenship. "Think these Germans are ready for some chocolate-colored liberators?" Johnson joked, adjusting his helmet. Jackson smiled slightly but shook his head. "They've been told we're barely human for years. Don't expect a warm welcome. I got something warm for 'em right here," quipped Private Henry Lewis, patting his M1 Garand rifle. At 23, Lewis had been a dock worker in Oakland before the war and had a reputation as the squad's most aggressive member. "Cool it, Lewis," Jackson advised. "These are civilians, women and children. Remember that." As the American forces prepared for their advance, Kurt Weber stood nervously at a makeshift roadblock with 7 other Volkssturm members, boys his age and old men in their 60s, none in proper uniform. Their leader, Gerhard Müller, a 67-year-old Great War veteran, paced behind them, checking their weapons, a motley collection of hunting rifles, a few Mauser 98K rifles, and 2 Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons. "When the tanks appear, aim for the tracks or the rear," Müller instructed, demonstrating with a Panzerfaust. "One good hit can stop a Sherman." Kurt held his weapon, an old bolt-action rifle that felt impossibly heavy in his hands, and tried to look brave, though his heart raced with fear. He had been raised on stories of German heroism, had been in the Hitler Youth since he was 10, and believed it was his duty to defend his homeland. But the sound of approaching engines filled him with dread. Ingrid arrived at the roadblock breathless. "Kurt, you come home right now." Müller stepped between them. "The boy stays, Frau Weber, by order of the local defense committee. Every German must do his part." "He's 12 years old," Ingrid protested. "Old enough to defend his mother and sister," Müller replied coldly. "Would you rather the American Negroes reach them first?" The crude implication silenced Ingrid momentarily, but she pushed past Müller and grabbed her son's arm. "Kurt, please." The boy hesitated, torn between his indoctrinated sense of duty and his mother's fear. Before he could decide, the distant rumble of engines grew louder, and the ground began to vibrate slightly. "They're coming!" shouted one of the older men. "Positions!" Ingrid's pleas grew more urgent. "Kurt, please, I've already lost your father." The boy looked from his mother to Müller, then made his decision. He handed the rifle to another boy and took his mother's hand. "I'm sorry, Herr Müller. I need to protect my family at home." Müller's face reddened with anger, but he had no time to argue as the sound of tank treads grew closer. "Go then. Cowards deserve what they get." Ingrid and Kurt hurried back toward town, the boy fighting tears of shame and confusion. Behind them, the meager defense force readied themselves for a battle they couldn't possibly win. The lead elements of the American force, 3 Sherman tanks from the 761st, followed by infantry from the 104th Infantry Division, approached the roadblock cautiously. Through his binoculars, Sergeant Washington could see the nervous defenders, noting with dismay how young some appeared. "Christ, they're using children," he muttered to his gunner, Corporal Davis. "Hold fire unless fired upon," came Lieutenant Morrison's order through the radio. "Let's try to resolve this without bloodshed." Morrison, in the command tank, ordered his driver to stop about 300 yards from the roadblock. Using a loudspeaker, he called out in German, "Attention, your position is surrounded. Lay down your weapons and you will not be harmed. Resistance is futile and will only result in unnecessary casualties." At the roadblock, the defenders looked to Müller for guidance. The old veteran's face was a mask of conflicting emotions: pride, fear, and growing realization that resistance would only get them all killed. "What do we do, Herr Müller?" asked one of the boys, voice cracking. Müller stared at the American tanks for a long moment, then slowly set down his Panzerfaust. "It's over," he said quietly. "Put down your weapons." One by one, the defenders laid down their arms, some with relief, others with tears of humiliation. As the Americans approached, the Germans raised their hands in surrender. The battle for Oberursel had ended before it began. By mid-afternoon, American troops had secured the town without firing a shot. The town's Nazi officials had fled the previous night, and the mayor, a non-party member appointed just days earlier when the previous mayor left, formally surrendered the town to the American commander. Throughout Oberursel, civilians watched from behind curtains as American troops established checkpoints and began house-to-house searches for weapons and hiding German soldiers. Most families remained hidden in their homes, terrified of what might happen next. Ingrid Weber had gathered her children in their basement, along with two elderly neighbors. They sat in fearful silence, listening to the sounds of boots on the street above. When heavy knocking came at their front door, Ingrid felt her heart nearly stop. "Stay here," she whispered to the others, gathering her courage. "I'll go." She climbed the stairs slowly, each step feeling like a march to execution. The knocking came again, more insistent. Taking a deep breath, Ingrid opened the door to find two American soldiers, both black, standing on her doorstep. One was tall and broad-shouldered, the other shorter but with an intense gaze. Both had rifles slung over their shoulders, but not pointed at her. "Guten Tag," the taller one said in accented German. It was Corporal Jackson, accompanied by Private Johnson. "Sprechen Sie English?" Ingrid shook her head, her mouth too dry to speak. She had studied some English in school decades ago, but remembered almost nothing. Jackson continued in his limited German, speaking slowly and clearly. "Wir suchen deutsche Soldaten und Waffen. Verstehen Sie?" Ingrid nodded, understanding they were searching for German soldiers and weapons. "Keine Soldaten, keine Waffen," she replied, finding her voice. "No soldiers, no weapons." Jackson nodded. "Wir müssen Ihr Haus durchsuchen. Es tut mir leid." He gestured to indicate they needed to search the house. Ingrid stepped aside, her body tense with fear. As the soldiers entered, she noticed something unexpected. They removed their helmets and wiped their feet on the mat. This small courtesy, so at odds with the savage behavior she had been led to expect, caught her by surprise. "Kinder?" Johnson asked, using the German word for children. "Ja," Ingrid replied cautiously. "Im Keller, in the basement." Jackson nodded reassuringly. "Sie sind sicher. They are safe. No harm." As they began their search, Ingrid watched them closely, ready to protect her family if necessary. But the soldiers conducted their inspection methodically and respectfully, careful not to damage anything. When they checked the basement and saw the frightened children and elderly neighbors, Johnson smiled gently and even gave a small wave to Helga, who hid behind her brother. Finding no weapons or soldiers, the Americans prepared to leave. At the door, Jackson reached into his pocket and Ingrid instinctively stepped back in fear. But instead of a weapon, he produced 2 Hershey chocolate bars, which he offered to Ingrid. "Für die Kinder," he said. "For the children." Ingrid stared at the chocolate in disbelief. Real chocolate had been unavailable to ordinary Germans for years. She took the bars with trembling hands, unable to speak. Jackson smiled. "Alles ist in Ordnung. Everything is okay. War is over for you." As the soldiers left, Ingrid stood in the doorway, watching them move to the next house, the chocolate bars heavy in her hand. Something shifted inside her, a small crack in the wall of propaganda that had shaped her worldview. Similar scenes played out across Oberursel that day as the black soldiers of the 761st Tank Battalion, along with white troops from supporting infantry units, secured the town. The expected atrocities never materialized. Instead, the Americans established order, began distributing emergency rations to the hungry population, and set up a medical station to treat both their own wounded and German civilians in need. That evening, Sergeant Washington supervised the distribution of food rations in the town square. A line of German civilians, mostly women, children, and the elderly, waited quietly, still fearful, but driven by hunger. Washington noticed how they avoided eye contact with him, how mothers pulled their children closer when he approached. "They think we're monsters," he remarked to Lieutenant Morrison, who was overseeing the operation. "Can't blame them entirely," Morrison replied. "They've been fed nothing but lies for years. Actions speak louder than words. Just keep doing what you're doing." Among those in line was Elisabeth Müller, the 64-year-old wife of Gerhard Müller, who had been detained with the other Volkssturm members. She watched the black soldiers warily, her body tense with anxiety. When it was her turn to receive rations, she found herself face to face with Sergeant Washington. "Guten Abend," Washington said politely, handing her a package containing canned meat, powdered milk, and bread. "Good evening." Elizabeth took the package without a word, her eyes downcast. But as she turned to leave, Washington added, "Ihr Mann ist in Sicherheit. Your husband is safe." Elizabeth looked up in surprise, meeting his eyes for the first time. "Mein Mann, Gerhard Müller." Washington nodded. "Yes, Gerhard Müller. He is being processed and will likely be released soon. He is unharmed." Tears filled Elizabeth's eyes. "Danke," she whispered, before hurrying away, clutching the precious rations. Word spread quickly through the town that the Volkssturm members had been treated humanely, that food was being distributed fairly, and that no atrocities had occurred. The relief was palpable, though many remained cautious, unable to fully trust that their luck would hold. The next morning, Ingrid Weber made a decision. The chocolate bars remained untouched on her kitchen table. She had been uncertain whether to give them to her children, still half expecting some trick or danger. But hunger and curiosity prevailed. She carefully unwrapped one bar, broke it into pieces, and shared it among her family and elderly neighbors. The rich sweetness was overwhelming after years of deprivation. Helga's eyes widened in delight, while Kurt savored each small piece as if memorizing the taste. The elderly neighbors, Herr and Frau Becker, wept openly at the forgotten pleasure. "The Americans gave you this?" Herr Becker asked incredulously. "The Negro soldiers?" Ingrid nodded. "They were. Not what we were told to expect." "Propaganda," Frau Becker said softly. "Always propaganda. First it was the Jews, now this." Herr Becker shot his wife a warning look, but Ingrid found herself nodding slowly. The thought that had begun forming the previous day grew stronger. If the regime had lied about this, what else had they lied about? That afternoon, Ingrid ventured outside for the first time since the Americans arrived, needing to find more food for her family. The town was transformed from the previous day. American vehicles lined the streets, soldiers stood at checkpoints, and gradually, more German civilians emerged from their homes, necessity overcoming fear. At the town center, Ingrid found a crowd gathered around a U.S. Army field kitchen, where soldiers were distributing hot soup and bread. To her astonishment, black and white soldiers worked side by side, handing out food without discrimination to the German civilians. In line ahead of her, an elderly woman stumbled, nearly falling. Before Ingrid could react, a black soldier, Private Johnson, caught the woman's arm, steadying her with gentle hands. "Vorsichtig, Großmutter," he said carefully. "Careful, grandmother." The old woman stared at him in shock, then murmured her thanks. Johnson smiled and returned to his duties, unaware of the profound effect this simple act of kindness had on those watching. When Ingrid reached the front of the line, she found herself facing Corporal Jackson, who recognized her immediately. "Guten Tag, Frau," he said with a slight smile. Hungry? Ingrid nodded. Ja, danke. Thank you for yesterday. The chocolate. Jackson's smile widened at her attempt at English. You're welcome. Kids enjoy? Yes, Ingrid replied. Very much. As Jackson filled a container with soup for her, he asked, Your name? Ingrid Weber, she replied, then added hesitantly, And you? Robert Jackson, he said, handing her the soup and 2 bread rolls. Detroit, Michigan. This simple exchange of names, this recognition of each other's humanity, was another crack in the wall of Ingrid's preconceptions. She took the food and nodded her thanks before stepping away to make room for others. Nearby, she noticed a group of American medics had set up a treatment station and were examining German children. A mother watched anxiously as a black medic gently checked her young son's throat and ears. Vitamin deficiency, the medic explained to a translator who relayed the information to the mother. Not serious yet, but needs better nutrition. He provided the mother with vitamin supplements and a special ration card for milk. Throughout the day, similar scenes unfolded across Oberursel. The feared monsters of Nazi propaganda were instead providing food, medical care, and reassurance to a population that had expected only brutality. For many Germans, this cognitive dissonance was difficult to process. Their entire worldview was being challenged by these daily interactions. By the 3rd day of occupation, a noticeable shift had occurred in Oberursel. The initial terror had given way to cautious relief, and in some cases tentative gratitude. Children, always quicker to adapt than adults, were the first to change their behavior. American soldiers, regardless of color, became a source of fascination rather than fear. Some handed out candy or showed photos of their families back home, building bridges through these simple human connections. For the soldiers of the 761st, the changing attitudes brought mixed feelings. They were fighting for a country that still treated them as second-class citizens, yet here they were, representatives of American values and power. Ironic, isn't it? Corporal Jackson remarked to Sergeant Washington as they observed German children gathered around Private Lewis, who was showing them how to play jacks. Back home, some of these white folks wouldn't let their kids near us. Over here, we're the face of American freedom. Washington nodded thoughtfully. Maybe that's part of why we're fighting, to show what America could be, should be. The town's transition from fear to coexistence wasn't uniform or without tension. Some residents, deeply indoctrinated by years of Nazi propaganda, remained suspicious and hostile. Others, particularly those who had been loyal party members, avoided the Americans entirely, fearful of retribution. On April 7th, the local detention center processed and released most of the Volkssturm members, including Gerhard Müller. The old veteran returned home physically unharmed, but psychologically shaken. He had expected to be shot or at least mistreated, but instead had been given food, medical attention for his arthritis, and eventually release papers. They asked me questions about Nazi officials, about hidden weapons, he told his wife Elizabeth upon his return. But there was no torture, no threats. They gave me cigarettes, Elizabeth. American cigarettes. Elizabeth nodded, unsurprised after what she had witnessed over the past days. They are not what we were told, Gerhard. Müller sank into a chair, suddenly looking every one of his 67 years. Nothing is what we were told, he said quietly. Nothing. That same day, Kurt Weber encountered a group of American soldiers setting up a basketball hoop in a cleared area near the town hall. Curious despite his lingering fear, he stood at a distance watching as black and white soldiers played together. Their shouts and laughter at odds with the grim, disciplined image of American troops he had been taught to expect. Private Johnson noticed the boy watching and called out to him, "Hey kid, want to play?" Kurt didn't understand the words but recognized the gesture. He hesitated, then shook his head, not ready for such direct interaction. Johnson shrugged good-naturedly and returned to the game. But Kurt didn't leave. He continued watching, mentally recording everything that contradicted what he had been taught. Later that evening at dinner, Kurt shared his observations with his family. "They play games together," he said, still sounding bewildered. "The white and black soldiers. They laugh together. Ingrid nodded, serving the vegetable soup that was their main meal, now supplemented with American rations. Yes, I've seen the same. But why did they tell us they were enemies? Kurt pressed, his young mind struggling to reconcile the contradictions. The radio said the black soldiers were forced to fight, that they hated the white Americans. Ingrid exchanged glances with the Beckers, who were again sharing their meal. There have been many lies, Kurt, she said carefully. We are only now discovering how many. The Führer lied to us? Helga asked innocently, causing a moment of tense silence. Even now, criticizing Hitler directly felt dangerous, a habit of fear deeply ingrained. Leaders sometimes believe things that aren't true, Ingrid finally answered, finding a diplomatic response. And then they tell others these untruths. Herr Becker cleared his throat. There is a difference between being mistaken and deliberately misleading people, he said quietly. What we are seeing now suggests the latter. The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Kurt went to answer it, returning with news that all residents were required to attend a town meeting the following morning. The night passed anxiously for many in Oberursel, as rumors spread about the purpose of the meeting. Some feared it would be the start of punishments, that the Americans' relative benevolence had been merely a prelude to retribution. When morning came, hundreds of Germans gathered tentatively in the town square. American soldiers stood guard around the perimeter, their presence both reassuring and intimidating. A table had been set up in front of the town hall, where several American officers sat alongside the acting mayor. Major William Patterson of the 104th Infantry Division stood to address the crowd, with a German-American soldier translating his words. "People of Oberursel," he began, his voice firm but not unkind. "The United States Army now has administrative control of your town. We are not here to punish civilians, but to maintain order and begin the process of rebuilding. However, we require your cooperation." He outlined the immediate rules: a curfew from 8 p.m. to 6 a.m., restrictions on travel outside town limits, mandatory registration for all adults, surrender of any remaining weapons, and prohibition of Nazi symbols or materials. Furthermore, Patterson continued, all former Nazi Party members must register with our Civil Affairs Office for screening. Those found to have committed crimes will face justice. Those who were nominal members only will not be punished. A murmur ran through the crowd at this unexpected distinction between levels of Nazi involvement. Finally, Patterson concluded, we will begin distributing regular food rations tomorrow. Medical services are available at the school building. Any acts of sabotage or resistance will be dealt with severely, but those who cooperate will be treated fairly. After the meeting, the mood in town was one of cautious relief. The feared mass arrests or punishments hadn't materialized. Instead, the Americans were establishing a pragmatic occupation focused on order and basic necessities. For Sergeant Washington and the men of the 761st, the day brought a new assignment: overseeing food distribution at multiple locations throughout town. Washington's team, including Corporal Jackson and Privates Johnson and Lewis, set up at the Western Distribution Point, where they would handle rations for about 200 families. As they organized supplies, Washington briefed his men. Remember, keep it fair and orderly. These people are hungry and scared. Our job isn't just handing out food, it's showing them what Americans stand for. Even if America doesn't always stand for us, Lewis muttered, but quietly enough that only Johnson heard him. When distribution began, the Germans lined up silently, still uncomfortable with direct interaction. But as the process continued, something remarkable happened. A young girl, perhaps 5 years old, stepped forward with her mother to receive their rations from Private Johnson. Instead of avoiding eye contact like the adults, she stared at him with undisguised curiosity. "Hello," she said simply. Johnson smiled. "Hello." The girl reached out hesitantly and touched his hand, as if to confirm he was real. "Chocolate?" she asked hopefully. Johnson laughed and reached into his pocket, producing a small chocolate bar he'd been saving. "Just for you, little miss," he said, placing it in her tiny hand. The girl's face lit up with delight, and she turned to her mother excitedly. The woman, initially tense, relaxed slightly and nodded her thanks to Johnson. This small interaction was observed by others in line, and the atmosphere subtly shifted. The next family approached less hesitantly, and the father actually extended his hand to Johnson in greeting, a profound gesture given the circumstances. By mid-afternoon, news of the 761st's fair and friendly distribution had spread, and Germans began bringing small tokens of appreciation, a handful of fresh eggs, homemade bread, even flowers picked from gardens. Many still couldn't bring themselves to fully interact with the black soldiers, but the fear was visibly diminishing. Ingrid Weber arrived at the distribution point late in the day, accompanied by Kurt and Helga. When they reached the front of the line, they found themselves facing Corporal Jackson. "Mrs. Weber," Jackson greeted her with recognition. "Good to see you again." Ingrid smiled slightly, surprising herself with the genuine feeling behind it. "Good afternoon, Corporal Jackson." Kurt stared openly at Jackson, his curiosity overcoming his remaining fear. "You're from Detroit?" he asked in halting English, having remembered what Jackson had told his mother days earlier. Jackson looked surprised but pleased at the boy's attempt to communicate. "Yes, Detroit. Motor City. Automobiles." He made a steering motion with his hands. "Like Volkswagen?" Kurt asked, referring to the people's car that had been heavily promoted by the Nazi regime, though few civilians had ever owned one. "Bigger. Ford, Chevrolet, Chrysler," Jackson replied. Then, to Kurt's amazement, he pulled out his wallet and showed a photograph of a gleaming Chevrolet. "My car before the war." Kurt's eyes widened. "Your car, but your—" He stopped, realizing what he had been about to say. Jackson understood. "Yes, my car. In America, many people have cars. All kinds of people." This simple statement contained a profound contradiction to Nazi racial propaganda, which had portrayed black Americans as primitive and impoverished. Kurt fell silent, processing this new information as Jackson handed them their ration packages. As they walked home, Kurt remained thoughtful. "He has his own car," he finally said to his mother. "They said Negroes in America were all poor and lived like savages." Ingrid nodded slowly. "Yes. They told us many things that weren't true." "What else did they lie about?" Kurt asked, the question hanging heavily in the air between them. Ingrid had no answer, at least none she was ready to articulate fully. The foundations of her worldview were crumbling, and she was still trying to make sense of the new reality, emerging from the ruins of the old. The next day brought another development that further challenged the town's preconceptions. A medical team from the U.S. Army, including 2 black doctors, established a more permanent clinic in the school building. For many Germans, the idea of being treated by black physicians was initially unthinkable. Nazi racial theory had explicitly ranked black people as intellectually inferior and incapable of such skilled professions. Captain Marcus Reynolds, a graduate of Howard University Medical School, led the team. At 32, Reynolds had overcome numerous obstacles to become a doctor, only to face new barriers in the army, which had initially been reluctant to commission black physicians. Now he found himself treating the very people whose government had proclaimed his inherent inferiority. Word spread quickly through Oberursel about the American doctors. Many residents were desperate for medical care after years of shortages and deprivation, but some hesitated to visit the clinic because of the black physicians. Others, however, had begun to question the racial stereotypes they had accepted as truth. Among those in need of medical attention was Helga Weber, who had developed a persistent cough and fever. Ingrid, concerned for her daughter, made the decision to take her to the American clinic, despite her lingering apprehensions. The school gymnasium had been converted into a medical facility, with separate areas for examination, treatment, and a small pharmacy. When Ingrid and Helga arrived, they found several German families already waiting, sitting on benches along the wall. A white nurse recorded their information, then directed them to wait. Helga clung to her mother, intimidated by the unfamiliar surroundings and the foreign voices. When their turn came, they were led to an examination area where Captain Reynolds waited, dressed in an immaculate white coat over his uniform. "Guten Tag," he greeted them in accented German, then switched to English when an interpreter joined them. "What seems to be the problem today?" Through the interpreter, Ingrid explained Helga's symptoms: the cough, fever, and increasing weakness. Reynolds listened attentively, then approached Helga with a gentle smile. "I'm going to examine you now," he said, the interpreter translating. "Nothing will hurt, I promise." Despite her initial fear, Helga allowed the examination, watching with wide eyes as Reynolds used his stethoscope and other instruments with practiced skill. His manner was kind and professional, putting both mother and daughter at ease. "Your daughter has bronchitis," Reynolds explained after the examination. "Not severe yet, but we should treat it before it worsens. I'm prescribing an antibiotic and cough medicine. She also shows signs of malnutrition, which is making it harder for her to fight the infection." He wrote out prescriptions and handed them to the nurse, who went to fetch the medications. While they waited, Reynolds asked Ingrid about their living conditions and diet, making notes for the civil affairs officers who were assessing civilian needs. "The medicine should help quickly," he assured them, as the nurse returned with bottles of pills and syrup. "Bring her back in 3 days so I can check her progress." Ingrid thanked him, then hesitated before asking, "Where did you learn to be a doctor?" If Reynolds was offended by the question and its implicit assumptions, he didn't show it. "I studied at Howard University in Washington, D.C., he answered through the interpreter. "I've been practicing medicine for 7 years. Ingrid nodded, another piece of her indoctrinated worldview falling away. "Thank you, doctor," she said simply. As they left the clinic, Helga looked up at her mother. "He was nice," she said. "Not scary at all." "No," Ingrid agreed. "Not scary at all." The medicines worked quickly, and Helga's condition improved over the next 2 days. For Ingrid, this tangible evidence of Captain Reynolds's medical expertise further eroded the racial myths she had accepted for years. If Nazi propaganda had been so wrong about this, what else had been false? This question was increasingly on the minds of many in Oberursel as they interacted with the American forces, particularly the black soldiers whose humanity and professionalism daily contradicted years of racist indoctrination. By the end of the first week of occupation, a remarkable transformation was occurring in the town. Fear had largely given way to cautious acceptance, and in some cases, genuine appreciation. Children, especially, had adapted quickly. American soldiers became a source of candy, chewing gum, and novel games. Adults, though more reserved, gradually began to interact more openly with their occupiers. For the soldiers of the 761st Tank Battalion, this evolution in attitudes was both validating and bittersweet. They were being accepted as equals by former enemies, while knowing that back home, such acceptance was still denied them in many places. "You know what's crazy?" Private Lewis remarked to his squad as they relaxed off duty. "Last week these people thought we were going to eat their babies. Now they're bringing us home-cooked meals and smiling like we're old friends." "Don't get too comfortable," Sergeant Washington cautioned. "They're being friendly because we have the power now, and we have the food. Doesn't mean their attitudes have completely changed." "Some have changed," Jackson argued. "You can see it in their eyes, that moment when they realize everything they believed was a lie. That's a powerful thing." Johnson nodded. "Reminds me of my grandmother's saying, 'Nothing kills a lie faster than living the truth.'" As the days passed, more Volkssturm members and Hitler Youth were processed and released, returning to a town increasingly adapted to American occupation. The strict military presence gradually relaxed, as it became clear there would be no organized resistance. Food distribution became more regular, and some semblance of normal life began to return. For Gerhard Müller, the former Volkssturm leader, this new reality was particularly difficult to accept. He had been a dedicated Nazi party member since 1933, had believed wholeheartedly in the Führer and the ideology of Aryan supremacy. Now everything he had built his identity around was revealed as false. On April 12th, Müller sat on a bench in the town square, watching American soldiers, black and white together, helping local workers clear rubble from a building damaged in an earlier Allied bombing. He observed their camaraderie, their easy interaction across racial lines that Nazi ideology had claimed was impossible. When Sergeant Washington walked past, Müller surprised himself by calling out, "Herr Sergeant!" Washington paused, turning to the old man with a questioning look. Müller struggled for the English words, finally managing, Why you help us, after all? Washington considered the question, then sat down beside Müller. Through a combination of basic German, simple English, and gestures, they managed a halting conversation. We're soldiers, Washington explained. We follow orders, but we're also human beings. War is over for this town. Now we help. But the things we believed about you, Müller said, unable to fully articulate his confusion. Washington nodded in understanding. Propaganda, we had it too. Not all Germans are Nazis. Not all Americans are the same. Müller looked down at his weathered hands. I was wrong, he said simply. For many years I was wrong. It was as close to an apology as the proud old man could come, but Washington recognized the significance of the admission. Many people were wrong, he replied. On both sides. After Washington left, Müller remained on the bench for a long time, his worldview irrevocably altered by this simple human exchange. As April progressed, news from the broader war reached Oberursel. Hitler had retreated to his bunker in Berlin. The Soviet forces were closing in from the east, and the Third Reich was clearly in its final days. For most civilians, the primary concerns remained immediate and practical: food, shelter, and the uncertainties of life under occupation. For the Weber family, like many others, a new routine had developed. Kurt helped American engineers clear roads and repair infrastructure, receiving extra rations for his work. Helga had recovered from her illness and now attended an improvised school set up by the Americans with German teachers who had been cleared of Nazi affiliations. Ingrid worked at a community kitchen, cooking meals from American supplies for those unable to prepare their own food. The kitchen brought Ingrid into daily contact with American soldiers, including Corporal Jackson, who often delivered supplies. Their interactions had evolved from fearful caution to professional courtesy, and gradually to something approaching friendship. On April 16th, Jackson arrived at the kitchen with an unusual delivery, not just the standard rations, but boxes of chocolate, coffee, and other luxury items that most Germans hadn't seen in years. Special shipment, he explained as he helped unload the truck. Apparently someone up the chain decided you folks could use a morale boost. Ingrid and the other German women stared at the bounty in disbelief. Real coffee had been unavailable to civilians for years, replaced by ersatz substitutes made from roasted grains or acorns. Chocolate had been similarly absent, except for the occasional bars given to soldiers or party officials. This is very generous, Ingrid said, examining a can of coffee with almost reverent hands. Jackson shrugged. Seems like the least we can do. War's hard on everyone, especially civilians. As they worked together to organize the supplies, Ingrid found herself increasingly curious about this man who defied everything she had been taught to believe. May I ask you something, Corporal Jackson? Robert, he corrected her, and sure, ask away. Robert, she acknowledged with a nod. Why did you join the army? To fight against Germany, I mean. Jackson considered the question carefully before answering. I joined to fight for America, he said, even though America doesn't always fight for people like me. Seeing her confusion, he elaborated, in my country, black Americans face discrimination, segregation, second-class citizenship. Yet when war came, we still volunteered to serve. Why? Ingrid asked, genuinely puzzled. If your country treats you unfairly. Because fighting against fascism, against the idea that some races are superior to others, that's fighting for a better America too, Jackson explained. Hitler took ideas about racial superiority to their logical extreme. We're fighting to prove those ideas wrong, everywhere they exist. Ingrid absorbed this in thoughtful silence. The parallel between Nazi racial ideology and American segregation was something she had never considered before. In some ways, Jackson continued, this war is forcing America to confront its own contradictions. How can we claim to fight for freedom abroad while denying it at home? More and more people are asking that question. His words stayed with Ingrid long after he had left, adding new dimensions to her evolving understanding of the world. The simple narrative of good versus evil, of German superiority versus foreign inferiority, had been replaced by a more complex reality where even the victorious Americans were wrestling with their own moral inconsistencies. That evening, as the Weber family shared a meal enhanced by the special deliveries, bread with real butter, sauce with actual meat, and small pieces of chocolate for dessert, Ingrid recounted her conversation with Jackson. "He fights for a country that discriminates against him," she explained to Kurt, who listened with intense interest, "because he believes defeating Hitler's ideas helps everyone." Kurt nodded slowly, processing this information. At 12, he was at an age where absolutes were being replaced by nuance, where the black-and-white worldview of childhood was giving way to shades of grey. "So America isn't perfect either," he concluded. "No country is perfect," Ingrid said, surprising herself with how confidently she now contradicted the nationalist propaganda that had once seemed unquestionable. "People are just people, everywhere." April 20th, 1945, marked Hitler's 56th birthday, once a major celebration throughout the Reich. In Oberursel, as in many occupied towns, the day passed without acknowledgement, the former Führer's cult of personality already fading into history. That same day, Captain Reynolds and his medical team faced a new challenge. An outbreak of dysentery threatened the town, a common problem in post-conflict situations where sanitation systems might be compromised. The American medical staff worked tirelessly, treating the sick and implementing preventive measures. When Helga Weber developed symptoms, Ingrid rushed her to the clinic, now familiar enough with the American doctors to feel confident in their care. Captain Reynolds examined the girl quickly and arranged for her to receive intravenous fluids to prevent dehydration. "She'll need to stay overnight for monitoring," Reynolds explained through the interpreter. "We have a children's ward set up in the classroom next door." Ingrid hesitated at the prospect of leaving her daughter, but Reynolds understood her concern. "You can stay with her," he assured her. "We've set up cots for parents." The children's ward contained a dozen small beds, half of them already occupied by young patients. A black nurse, Lieutenant Sarah Johnson, was checking on each child, offering gentle words of reassurance despite the language barrier. As Helga was settled into a bed, Ingrid noticed a remarkable scene. German children, who just weeks earlier had been taught to fear black people as subhuman, now accepting care from black medical personnel without hesitation. Some even smiled at Lieutenant Johnson as she took temperatures and adjusted IV lines. Through the night, Ingrid observed the American medical team working with unwavering dedication. Lieutenant Johnson stayed on duty well past her scheduled shift, singing softly to a feverish child until he fell asleep, checking on each patient with maternal care. By morning, Helga's condition had improved significantly. As Reynolds examined her, Ingrid asked the interpreter to convey a question that had been forming in her mind. "Why do you treat us with such kindness? After what Germany did, what we believed about you?" Reynolds paused before answering, his expression thoughtful. "Because that's what doctors do," he said simply. "We treat the patient in front of us regardless of who they are or what they believe, and because proving your stereotypes wrong is more powerful than any revenge could be." Helga was released that afternoon with medication and instructions for home care. As they left the clinic, they passed a group of newly arrived patients, Wehrmacht soldiers who had been wounded and captured in fighting farther east. The American medical staff were preparing to treat them with the same care they had shown the civilians. "They help everyone," Helga observed, leaning against her mother as they walked slowly home. "Even the soldiers who fought against them." "Yes," Ingrid agreed, another piece of her former worldview dissolving in the face of undeniable evidence. "That's what civilization looks like, I suppose." The end of April brought news that shook Germany to its core, reports that Hitler had committed suicide in his Berlin bunker as Soviet forces closed in on the capital. For many Germans, including those in Oberursel, this marked the definitive end of the Nazi era that had dominated their lives for 12 years. The news affected different people in different ways. Some mourned, having genuinely believed in Hitler despite everything. Others felt relief that the war might finally end completely. Many experienced complex emotions, grief not for Hitler himself but for the country's devastation, for the lives lost, for the years of devotion to what now seemed a terrible mistake. In Oberursel, The American occupation continued with increasing cooperation from the local population. Military government officials began the process of denazification, removing Nazi supporters from positions of authority and replacing them with those untainted by party membership. For the soldiers of the 761st Tank Battalion, including Sergeant Washington and his squad, the changing dynamics in Oberursel represented a small victory within the larger war, a victory not just over military opposition, but over the poisonous ideology that had fueled the conflict. "You know what I realized yesterday?" Private Johnson said to his comrades as they maintained their tanks, preparing for possible redeployment. "I haven't heard the word Negro or seen people crossing the street to avoid me in over a week. Kind of nice, in a weird way." "Enjoy it while it lasts," Lewis replied with characteristic cynicism. "Back home, nothing's changed." "Maybe not yet," Jackson said thoughtfully, "but this war is changing things, slowly. People like us serving, proving ourselves, that matters. The world is watching." Washington listened to his men, understanding both the optimism and the skepticism. As a leader, he tried to balance pragmatism with hope, knowing that their experience in Germany was simultaneously transformative and temporary. On May 7, 1945, news reached Oberursel that Germany had surrendered unconditionally to the Allied forces. The war in Europe was officially over. The announcement brought no celebrations in the defeated country, but rather a somber recognition that a new era had begun. For the Weber family, like many Germans, the surrender formalized what they had already accepted, the complete collapse of the Nazi regime and its worldview. That evening they sat in their small garden, enjoying the spring evening and the relative peace that had settled over the town. "What happens now?" Kurt asked, giving voice to the uncertainty they all felt. "We rebuild," Ingrid replied simply. "We learn from mistakes. We start again." Kurt nodded, then asked the question that had been forming in his mind for weeks. Were they all lies? Everything they taught us in school, in Hitler Youth? Ingrid considered her answer carefully, aware of the responsibility in shaping her son's understanding of their recent history. "Not everything," she said finally, "but the most important things, about who is worthy of respect, about who deserves to be treated as human. Yes, those were lies. The Americans have shown us that. Especially the black soldiers," Helga added with the directness of a child. "They gave us chocolate when they could have been mean to us." "Yes," Ingrid agreed, remembering her initial terror when facing Jackson and Johnson at her door, how that fear had transformed into respect and even friendship. They chose kindness over vengeance. That's something to remember. The following day brought news that affected the 761st Tank Battalion directly. They were to be redeployed, moving eastward to join occupation forces in areas previously held by German troops. For the soldiers, it meant leaving Oberursel, a place that had unexpectedly become significant in their wartime experience. Word of their departure spread quickly through the town, eliciting mixed reactions. Some residents had formed genuine connections with the American troops, particularly the black soldiers whose humanity had so contradicted Nazi propaganda. Others remained ambivalent, still processing the collapse of their former worldview. On the morning of their departure, May 9th, the tanks and vehicles of the 761st assembled in the town square. Sergeant Washington supervised the loading of equipment, while his men made final preparations. To their surprise, a small crowd of German civilians gathered to watch, not with hostility, but with something approaching respect. Among them was the Weber family. Ingrid had felt it important for her children to say goodbye to the men who had inadvertently taught them such profound lessons. Kurt stood tall beside her, no longer the frightened boy who had nearly faced American tanks with a weapon he could barely hold. When Corporal Jackson spotted them, he approached with a smile. "Frau Weber, Kurt, Helga, came to see us off." Ingrid nodded. "We wanted to thank you for everything." "Just doing our job," Jackson replied modestly. "No," Ingrid said with quiet conviction. "You did much more than your job. You showed us the truth." Jackson understood the deeper meaning behind her words. "Truth's powerful that way," he said. "Once seen, it can't be unseen." Kurt stepped forward, holding out a small package wrapped in paper. "For you," he said in careful English, "to remember." Jackson unwrapped it to find a hand-carved wooden figure, a small tank roughly shaped but clearly made with great effort. "Did you make this?" he asked, genuinely touched. Kurt nodded proudly. "Last night. My father taught me before." He trailed off, the loss still painful. "It's excellent," Jackson said, pocketing the carving carefully. "I'll keep it always." From nearby, Sergeant Washington called, "Jackson, time to move out." Jackson nodded to his sergeant, then turned back to the Weber family. "Take care of yourselves," he said. "Remember what you've learned here." "We will," Ingrid promised. Then, in a gesture that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier, she extended her hand to him. Jackson took it, the handshake symbolizing a transformation that went beyond personal connection. It represented the beginning of a new understanding, a repudiation of the hatred that had fueled the war. As the American convoy prepared to depart, other scenes of farewell played out across the square. Elizabeth Müller pressed a loaf of homemade bread into Private Johnson's hands. Children waved to soldiers who had given them candy and taught them games. Even old Gerhard Müller stood at attention, offering a respectful nod to Sergeant Washington as he passed. The tanks and vehicles moved out in orderly procession, leaving behind a town forever changed by their presence. The people of Oberursel watched until the last vehicle disappeared from view, then slowly dispersed to continue the business of rebuilding their lives and their understanding of the world. In the months that followed, Oberursel, like the rest of Germany, began the long process of physical and psychological reconstruction. The American occupation continued, though with different units rotating through. The denazification process removed former party officials from positions of influence, and gradually democratic institutions were re-established. For the Weber family, life slowly improved. Kurt returned to school, now purged of Nazi ideology, and taught by teachers carefully screened for political reliability. Helga thrived as food became more plentiful, and her health improved. Ingrid found work as a translator for the occupation authorities, her basic English skills developing through necessity and practice. In their modest home, one memento of the occupation held special significance, an empty Hershey chocolate wrapper preserved in Helga's small keepsake box. The chocolate itself had been consumed that first week, but the wrapper remained as a tangible reminder of the moment when fear had given way to understanding, when propaganda had crumbled in the face of simple human kindness. The soldiers of the 761st Tank Battalion continued their service in the European theater until their return to the United States in early 1946. Their unit had earned distinction on the battlefield, including a Presidential Unit Citation for extraordinary heroism. Individual members received numerous decorations, including Bronze Stars and Purple Hearts. Yet, despite their service and sacrifice, these black soldiers returned to an America still deeply segregated, where their uniform commanded respect in some quarters, but provided no shield against discrimination in others. The irony was not lost on them. They had helped defeat fascism abroad while its echoes remained in their homeland. For Corporal Robert Jackson, the return to Detroit brought both familiar comforts and renewed frustrations. The small carved tank from Kurt Weber traveled with him, a reminder of connections formed across supposed divides. Jackson eventually used the GI Bill to complete his education, becoming a teacher in Detroit's public schools, where he quietly challenged racial prejudice by example and education, just as he had done in occupied Germany. Private Marcus Johnson returned to Mississippi to find that his combat service earned him little respect in the still segregated South. Undeterred, he became involved in the nascent civil rights movement, drawing on his wartime experiences to challenge the contradictions in American society. "I helped free Europe from fascism," he would say at community meetings. "Now it's time to free ourselves." Sergeant James Washington remained in the military for several more years before retiring and settling in Philadelphia. He often spoke to community groups about his wartime experiences, including the transformation he had witnessed in Oberursel. "We defeated two enemies in Germany," he would explain, "the German army and the lie of racial superiority. The first victory was won with tanks and guns, The second was one with chocolate bars and basic human decency. In Oberursel, the impact of those April days in 1945 resonated for decades. When American forces established permanent bases in West Germany during the Cold War, many Germans remembered the lessons of that first encounter, that humanity transcends artificial categories of race or nationality, that kindness can bridge even the widest divides. For Ingrid Weber, the experience fundamentally altered her worldview and how she raised her children. She encouraged them to question authority, to seek evidence rather than accept propaganda, and most importantly, to judge people by their actions rather than their appearance or origin. Kurt Weber grew up to become an engineer, helping rebuild Germany's infrastructure during the economic miracle of the 1950s. He never forgot the carved tank he had given to Corporal Jackson or the lessons he had learned at 12 years old about the danger of unquestioning belief. Helga Weber, influenced by her childhood experience with Captain Reynolds and the American medical team, pursued a career in nursing. In later years, she would tell her own children about the Black Doctor, who had treated her with kindness when others might have chosen retribution. The story of Oberursel was repeated with variations across Germany as the occupied population encountered Americans who contradicted Nazi racial stereotypes. These personal interactions, multiplied thousands of times, helped dismantle the psychological foundations of Nazi ideology more effectively than any formal denazification program. The transformation was neither universal nor immediate. Some Germans held fast to their prejudices, finding new justifications when old ones failed. Others embraced change superficially while harboring old beliefs privately. But for many, the direct experience of human connection across supposed racial divides created genuine change that influenced Germany's post-war development. By the early 1960s, as America itself confronted the civil rights movement, Ingrid Weber, now in her 50s, followed the news with particular interest. She recognized in Martin Luther King Jr. his dream of racial harmony echoes of what she had glimpsed in those April days of 1945, the possibility of judging people not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. In 1965, 2 decades after the war's end, an unexpected letter arrived at the Weber home in Oberursel. It came from Detroit, Michigan, and was signed Robert Jackson, formerly Corporal, 761st Tank Battalion. Jackson had maintained sporadic correspondence with the family over the years, but this letter contained something special, a photograph of Jackson with his wife and 3 children standing proudly beside a new Chevrolet. With the photo was a small package wrapped in brown paper. Inside, Ingrid found a Hershey chocolate bar and a note. 20 years later, still the best ambassador America ever had. Some things change, some stay the same. Friendship endures. Ingrid smiled at the familiar silver wrapper, remembering her terror when first confronted by American soldiers, her shock at their unexpected kindness, and the gradual awakening that had followed. She broke the chocolate into pieces, sharing it with her now adult children and her young grandchildren, using the moment to retell the story of fear overcome, of prejudice confronted by reality, of humanity recognized across artificial divides. It was a small moment in a small town, one of countless such moments across post-war Europe. But in these accumulated personal transformations lay the seeds of greater change, the recognition that the other we are taught to fear is often more similar to ourselves than different, that kindness can bridge the widest gulfs of misunderstanding, and that sometimes the most powerful weapon against hatred is not force but compassion. The carved wooden tank that Kurt had given Jackson still sat on the American's mantelpiece, just as the Hershey wrapper remained in Helga's keepsake box, small artifacts of a moment when the carefully constructed walls of propaganda crumbled in the face of direct human connection. For the Weber family and the soldiers of the 761st, these mementos represented not just a historical footnote, but a profound lesson about how hearts and minds are truly changed, not through force or fear, but through simple acts of human decency that reveal our common humanity. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.